Hello and welcome to the Insight Business Podcast by The Office Space, a monthly business talk series that brings together innovative entrepreneurs and business leaders to explore trending topics and discuss the secrets of their success under a monthly theme. For our final insight of 2018, we're looking at the multi-generational workplace, their values, attitudes, and contributions. Meet our guests. Danling Xiao, a Chinese-born Australian artist, designer, sustainability advocate, and founder of Mundane Matters. Will Alexander, co-founder and executive producer of creative agency and post-production house Heckler. Hugh Mackay, psychologist, sociologist, social researcher, author, writer, and former teacher. The Insight Business Podcast is brought to you by Habituous Media, Golden Age Cinema, and InDesign.
Introduce our panel tonight. So like I said, we're very honoured to have the esteemed psychologist, sociologist, social researcher, writer and generational expert Hugh Mackay with us. Hugh has written 19 books. I have his 19th one here and we've got it available to purchase at the end and he will sign them as well for you. But he has been writing about the Australian way of life for 6 decades and I think it's just incredible. It's all sorts of things, like even our changing relationship with food and it's not just about generations, but really a whole myriad of things with the Australian culture. And we're going to hear from Hugh, but I'll get you to take a seat in the middle up here, Hugh. Please welcome Hugh Mackay. Oh, apologies, you're on the end. And next, I'm going to introduce our Millennial, Danling Xiao. So as founder of Mundane Matters, Danling is a true multi-hyphenate. So come in the middle with me, Danling. So her expertise spans a wide range of areas of design, marketing, social media, with a strong focus on environmental sustainability. I know you want to move on past the food phase, but she does incredible work if you look on her Instagram with food and just different kind of funny fruits and vegetables, but also the Chinese Year of the Dog. You put dogs in little Chinese outfits, which I thought was incredible as well. So Danling embodies the optimism, the creativity, the community and social mindedness and global connectivity that represents her millennial generation. And she has the secret to beating Google and the algorithm. So we'll talk about that as well. Please welcome Danling. And this is the coolest Gen Xer I know. So Will is from Heckler. He co-founded that in 2008? 10, apologies. And he is upstairs, so he's our neighbour above us, 2 floors up. So as the co-founder of Heckler, it's one of Australia's most successful design, animation and post-production houses. And it's behind a whole lot of campaigns that you probably know and love, like the Qantas in Flight work, the Shaggy car one when it's yeah, that one as well. And there's the team here from Heckler as well. For me, I think it's really interesting because Will and his team are at the cutting edge of what's happening in society, but also I think pushing the envelope and really shaping our attitudes and values. So please welcome Will Alexander. Wow, there's the team. So I have asked Hugh to read. I have marked up his book. I think that's a bit sacrilegious, but I apologise for that. And Hugh's going to just read and set the scene about the different generations. So your loud reading voice for us, Hugh.
Right. I'm being amplified, am I?
Not amplified, but you're being recorded, so everyone will hear you, though.
Right. Am I audible at the back? If I just talk like this? Good, lovely. Well, I'm sorry to subject you to this, but Naomi did ask me to read my own work. Generational diversity is a source of tension, bewilderment, and mutual suspicion that impinges on practically all of us and does more than most other forms of diversity to challenge our cultural complacency. If you accept the common practice of defining generations in roughly 15-year chunks, then the 3 dominant generations in contemporary Australian culture are baby boomers, the post-war generation born between the late 40s and early 60s. Actually, we can be very precise, 46 to 61, that 15-year period. Generation X, born between the early 60s and late 70s, And millennials, the smart new label for the old Gen Y, aren't you glad you're not called Gen Y anymore? Born between the late 70s and the mid-90s. It would be hard to imagine three more different cohorts of Australians, not because they set out to be different from each other, but because the accelerating rate of social, cultural, economic, and technological change through the second half of the 20th century created radically different contexts for the formation of those three generations. Forgive the gross generalizations, but broadly, this is how they were shaped. Baby boomers rode an upward escalator of post-war prosperity and learnt to expect more of the same. And they lived with the tensions of the Cold War and the ever-present threat that it would turn hot. Their generational challenge was to reconcile the rosy prospect of endless prosperity with the equally likely prospect of nuclear war and mass annihilation. They embraced instant gratification as their generational ethos. Their generational catch cry became, "We're not here for a long time, we're here for a good time." They became famously short-term planners and poor savers. They also became impatient iconoclasts and protesters, not only about the Vietnam War, but also about the place of women as second-class citizens in society, about the patriarchal culture and punitive ethos of religion, and about the broader right of young people to be taken seriously. Their sheer size gave them a loud voice and a huge footprint. They expected to be seen and heard. They've come to see themselves as the forever young generation, believing that they look younger, feel younger, and are fitter, healthier, and more stylish than their own parents had been at the same age. Generally speaking, they're right about all that. New laws allowed them to become our most divorced generation in history, though their children may outdo them. Economic upheavals made them our most retrenched and unemployed generation since the Great Depression. And the women's movement liberated many women from the shackles of the attitudes and values they had inherited from their own mothers and grandmothers, while leaving many men bewildered by the assault on the attitudes and values they had inherited from their fathers and grandfathers. The boomers also had to rise to the early challenges posed by the information and communication technology revolution. Their world was being profoundly and sometimes mysteriously reshaped by that generation. Generation X, largely shaped by the cultural influences of the 1970s and 80s, might as well have been a different breed from that shaped by the 1950s and 60s. Think ABBA versus the Beatles. They were like slipstreamers, neatly tucked in behind the revolutionary boomers, with much of the hard yakka of social change and reform having been done for them. The anti-Vietnam War protests had borne fruit, the threat of military conscription had passed, and the Whitlam era was upon them. Gender equality was an established part of their thinking, even though there were still many pockets of male chauvinism in the ranks of Gen X under the lingering influence of their own fathers. Think of them also as lifestylers. They took that word lifestyle and made it their own. They were settling into a sense of a newly confident Australia, more culturally mature, more ethnically diverse than ever, yet they had not been seduced by the prospect of endless economic prosperity, nor spooked by the threat of nuclear war. All that had passed by the time they reached early adulthood. The label Gen X was coined to symbolise the mysterious, indefinable X factor that so sharply distinguished them from the boomers. They were set for the long haul and wanted to make the most of it, but they were never gripped by the same generational impatience as the boomers. And so to the millennials. Mostly the offspring of boomer parents, the millennials are at least as different from Gen X as that generation was from the boomers. Their cultural formation through adolescence and early adulthood has been influenced by the upheavals of the 90s and the first decade of this new millennium. Older generations throughout history have criticised younger generations for not cheerfully adopting the values and following the conventions of their elders, but the attacks on the ethos and values of the millennials have been quite extraordinary. Lazy, self-indulgent, expecting everything to be handed to them on a plate, no respect for their elders, impatient. Most egregious of all, some boomers have taken to calling them the me generation, when that was the very label created for the young boomers by their own appalled elders. In fact, millennials have grown up with far more uncertainty, instability, and unpredictability than Gen X, and a different kind of uncertainty from that faced by the boomers. For the millennials, everything is uncertain. The prospect of stable work, affordable housing, questions about a commitment to marriage and parenthood. They are, after all, the offspring of our most divorced generation of parents, and their engagement with the ever-changing world of technology, where, as digital natives, they have appreciated the new social media, they've appropriated the new social media in ways that both mystify and worry their elders. As a result of all this, millennials appear to take unpredictability in their stride while being deeply affected by the knowledge that nothing stands still. For them, the next thing, whatever it is, job, partner, updated technology, is just over the horizon. Let's see what happens is a line that neatly sums up their caution about commitment, learnt from their own experience. They are marrying later, if at all, having children later, if at all, and buying real estate later, if at all, not because they are squandering their savings on smashed avocados, but because of their keep your options open philosophy. And what of the post-millennial generation born since the mid-1990s? Given our determinedly low birth rate, this is the smallest generation relative to total population we have ever produced. Many members of the rising generation are the product of overprotective parenting, often as overcompensation for absent parenting, and of a childhood that was filled with praise, reward, and the promise of endless praise and reward to come. You're wonderful, you can do anything. These are the children who were being saved from disappointment and failure, and who in the process were being given a seriously unrealistic expectation of what life would be like. As with any other aspect of diversity, we all have much to learn from the generations other than our own, the older from the younger just as much as the younger from the older. The challenge is clear for the members of any generation dealing with the members of any other generation. Listen, learn, adapt, accept.
Thank you, Hugh.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Norman.
That voice is amazing. So there's things that we are resonating with. I can hear the chuckles. What kind of sits well with you, and what are you differing with the Generation X?
I don't think I ever really had the X factor in Hugh put out. That was one, and we'll talk a little bit about that in my illustrious MCing career before I moved to behind the camera. I heard a great millennial quote coming in. I struggled taking a headshot and really badly. And anyway, I got told by a millennial today that I've got a great face for a podcast. So instead of a great face for radio. So I thought that was pretty cute. I could certainly identify in Hugh's words a lot, and it's quite scary to think how closely that you do fit the mould, I suppose. So through this exercise of researching and writing my responses, I guess that was the biggest surprise, that I really did fit into that category quite snugly, and I didn't ever think, I thought I was much more radical than I really am.
And Danling, how about you?
I think he would do very well. He would do very well in YouTube.
YouTube.
Thank you. Yeah, it's got a face for YouTube.
The new face.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks.
And what do you think about the labels that Hugh's read out there? They're not complimentary, some of the way that millennials are considered.
I take that I'm lazy. I definitely don't work as hard as probably a lot of people.
I disagree with that entirely, but we'll get to that as well.
I mean, life-work balance, I think that's very important for me. I don't know if I represent other millennials, but I don't really like the label, to be honest.
It's better than Gen Y.
Yeah, totally.
It's an interesting point that Danling makes about work-life balance. I think a lot of millennials have looked at their baby boomer parents and said, we're not going to do that, which has been a cause of tension, I think, between a lot of mothers and daughters, where particularly boomers who saw themselves as pioneering feminists are now saying, why aren't you in our mould? What's all this stuff about you can do whatever you want to do, including stay home and look after your own kids? What's this? Or not be so totally devoted to a career.
And part of that is that technology obviously has allowed us to move away from the office, and Will, perhaps you talk about that. You've got 50 odd people that you work with. They're all varying ranges of, incredibly technically savvy. How do you keep up with all of those?
Our industry requires us to be very technologically savvy, but I got a new iPhone and I just heard it buzzing and I don't know how to actually turn it off. So I've still got a ways to go. We work in an excitingly fast-paced industry in film and media, and you have to be constantly updated and refreshed. And I think we've also got a very kind of open, every idea on our floor is kind of equal and valid. And I think that's part of being in a creative service business. So I think we're very lucky and fortunate to be able to play in that space where you can, where all your ideas, any idea, can come from anywhere. So I think that's encouraged in the workplace, and I think that's one of the lovely things about Heckler. And we encourage that to challenge the hierarchy and always challenge the work, but don't be hard on the people.
And you don't just employ millennials, even though they're all sitting along here.
No, not at all. We don't. I learnt from very generous and industry legends. My first ever job out of university was at a company called Resolution Design, and I was basically a runner, which is like the lowest on the food chain on a film set. And we were shooting the very famous Kids Choir commercial for Qantas with a lovely Scottish director called Ian McKenzie. And I remember my first day on the job, we shot a 14-hour day, and we used to shoot Kodak 35mm film back then. I don't know if you even know what Kodak is.
I do know.
So we used to shoot everything on celluloid, and my job was to take the unprocessed negative out to a place called Neg Lab in Hurstville, where I'd have to sit there for 4 hours while it was chemically bathed and processed, and I'd have to go back to Artarmon to the lab for a telecine. Again, all this technology and all these old filmmaking tools that we used to use. And I think I did 100 hours in my first week, and I was on $23,500, including super. And I loved every single minute of it. So, and it was a privilege to be part of the film industry. And that was my first week in film. And I always remember that. I don't know if millennials have that same kind of...
I've been brainwashed.
Yeah. I don't know if there's that same work ethic necessarily, or that same sense of being part of something really special as film is today.
Well, let's look at that idea of work ethic, because Danling, like I said, she's a multi-hyphen. It's the idea of having multiple roles and sort of like that freelance and gig economy. The things that this woman does, I'm exhausted listening to. And we were chatting about it and she's saying she's quite greedy. She's learning how to code in Python and dealing in the technology and all sorts of things. So perhaps tell us, why do you think that's lazy? I think you've got such a hunger and appetite.
I think it's more because I have seen my parents, especially my dad, just now I think he was actually quite lazy as well. He only, I think it's in my blood. He only started working since I started 2 o'clock in the afternoon, almost, and then he finished. He hangs with his people, his clients. They drink.
What was his job? He's in China?
Yeah.
And what was his job?
He already retired.
Okay.
He retired quite young.
And what did he do? What did you see his work as?
But I have seen his work. He's just working very hard. He runs a factory, a few factories actually, and just with I think the maximum number of people that he employed was 1,000 people in the factory, and that was just like for me it was quite shocking. I admired him a lot, but on the other hand, I was like, oh, Dad, how can you manage 1,000 people? That's like a little, a village.
And now this explains something else that we talked about. Danling had a concept. She had an e-commerce site, I think before Alibaba or around the time when Alibaba was getting started. And what did you want to do with your commerce site?
Oh,
you can tell the white people. You'll know why.
We're being not very nice tonight. So basically when Alibaba sort of started quite early in the early 2000s, I thought about, 2000, I would say 2010. I had this idea of, bringing products from Alibaba because they're so cheap. And then I built my own e-commerce site, and I was trying to sell them to the white people in the Western world. And it did really well, actually. But I didn't feel ethical of cheating to you guys. So
there you go.
So I shut it down.
So it could have been as big as Alibaba. So you can see different technology at play. And for you, Hugh, what sort of technology was part of, you've been researching and writing for, like we said, 60 years.
Well, I started work straight out of school, pre-computers, pre-television, everything done by hand. I almost went blind doing hand analysis of questionnaire results in my first job. It seems now extraordinarily primitive. So in my working life, I've seen, first of all, the arrival of television, to say nothing of what's happened since, particularly with social media, but also, of course, the entire information technology revolution that's revolutionised the research industry as well as every other industry, and not always in a good way. I mean, about 12 years into my research career, 8 years into my research career, I discovered the whole idea of qualitative research, the idea of getting beneath simple answers to set questions that would be statistically processed, and just trying to explore what's going on in people's lives and in their heads and what they dream of and so on, mainly through unstructured individual interviewing, but also with small groups of friends and neighbours and work colleagues, just chatting very informally in their natural habitat. A brilliant technique, really, for finding out what people feel. It's a technique that's almost vanished. It's been replaced by the dreaded focus group, which I'll talk about if you want me to, but it makes my flesh creep.
Yeah, maybe not then.
But that whole qualitative thing became a revolution in our understanding of the Australian way of life, really. But it's almost gone. I mean, the focus group thing has got almost nothing to do with the original unstructured, free-flowing, natural habitat, friends and neighbours group discussion. It's now a collection of strangers put in a strange place and expected to bare their souls.
It's interesting. It's obviously incredibly formative to the work that you've ended up doing over your career. 25 years before Reimagining Australia, Hugh wrote Reinventing Australia, which is all about the 90s. Can you give us an insight into that part of our history. I've got a quote that you've said, it's one of the most challenging periods in our history. So I'm wondering if that was challenging or it's now more challenging now. What was happening in the 90s?
Well, an interesting point. I mean, when I wrote that was like a sort of compendium of about 15 years of research reports on what had been happening in Australia from the late 70s through to the early 90s. And it seemed as though this was, well, it was a period of unprecedented social, cultural, political, economic upheaval. But if you look at it from the perspective of 2018, it was a mill pond. You know, it's so much more turbulent now. But what was happening then was really 4 generations at once. The gender revolution was really gaining a head of steam by then. I mean, it started in the 70s, gathered a bit of momentum through the 80s. By the 90s, it was really on, and that was being reflected in the soaring divorce rate and in a lot of other. I mean, it was being producing a revolution in the workplace because women were seeing work as the symbol of their liberation, and it was changing the face of politics. I mean, it's hard to say this sort of thing with a straight face now, but it used to be just taken for granted that women would vote the way their husbands did. No one ever talked about the women's vote. By the 90s, we were talking about the women's vote. So that was all going on. And that, of course, also was feeding into massive increase in educational levels for women, which in every society around the world is always correlated with a falling birth rate. So the really big, I mean, the birth rate started declining in 1961, but the decline accelerated through the 90s. So there was all that going on. There was also an absolute, and of course it wasn't just about women, that was also about men trying to come to terms with what gender equality could possibly mean, which is why the divorce rate was so high, because so many of them, I mean, for the first time in our history, most divorces were being initiated by women. So that was an upheaval. But we were also going through an economic upheaval, highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression, interest rates that you can hardly bring yourself to state, like 18%. Compare that with today. Deregulation of so many markets, and a sense that economic security was no longer to be taken for granted, and that included job security. The advent of job insecurity as a sort of epidemic happened in the 1990s. There was also a revolution in our sense of who we are, our cultural identity.
I'd love to pick up on the idea of identity as well, and also the multiculturalism as well, which is something that we'll talk about. I want to find out, Will, what was happening for you in the 90s and how that has sort of formulated you and how you look back on that.
I had a pretty wild teenage,
Is Dad
90s.
Here? Is Jim
here? Jim is here. So one of my first things I sort of remember growing up in the wonderfully leafy aspirational suburb of Hunters Hill and going to the local high school, though when I started writing this, I remember when I first picked up the pen vividly getting expelled by Bill Cooper for stealing a bottle of his whiskey from his drawer and having to go off to Newington College after that. Fortunately, my parents got me in and I was lucky enough to get through and I finished my HSC. But we were pretty crazy kids back in those days. Our baby boomer parents didn't really put a lot of rules and restrictions on us. So we kind of had free run of the place, and I chose really bad things. So it was pretty off the rails. And I look back, quite fortunate to have survived that kind of period. Just to give some context, fortunately I did get through school and I got accepted into the first ever strand of digital production out at the University of Western Sydney in Nepean. Excellent. And that was a pretty average campus, but I was drawn to digital production. And we used to sit in these shipping container converted classrooms in this paddock at the foot of the mountains, watching cows chewing outside. And I was pretty adamant I had to get out of there. So, fortunately though, I got enough credit points to get myself into Macquarie and then entered 2SER Radio, which is really where it all sort of happened for me. Excellent. And a hip hop show was born out of that. And that's where my sort of the digital production really came in, and we launched Australia's first digital pirate radio station, Pulse Radio, in the 90s.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And tell us about the MC career.
So the first show was called Headless Smoke on 2SER. It was broadcasting to the Macquarie Uni masses. We had very few listeners back in those days.
I don't remember listening.
I was trying desperately to become an MC myself, so I wanted to be a rapper.
Yes.
Eminem had just busted out on
the
scene. And but I'd never really had the X factor that Hugh talked about in his wonderful book. So I decided a career behind the camera and behind the mic, not on stage, was probably better off for me.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, I want to hear about your experience now as a parent. We'll jump to Danling, but just with Rose and Henry. But first, Danling, tell us, do you remember the 90s? What was happening for you? You're so young.
I think when you guys are having your upheaval and when you were like rapping, I was just peacefully playing jigsaw puzzles with my brother.
Yeah. Maybe the noughties. So what was happening for you then as you move into kind of the 2000 Y2K and all of that?
So that's when I came to Australia when I just turned 18. And that was quite, I would say, the period that I probably wouldn't want to go back at all, because it was just this massive loneliness and just almost, I would say, depression. Going through that kind of you being alone in another country and trying to I couldn't even speak English properly. And that, I think I spent a lot of time alone, and probably that's what shaped me today. Because also when I was little, I read a lot, and I just keep reading. I'm gonna get one of your books.
Yes, I'll give you one.
And throughout the period from when I was 18 till I would say 24, I was more kind of feeling like in a cocoon until I discovered this beautiful world of fashion and art, and all these surrealist artists or fashion designers like Vivienne Westwood or Marc Jacobs. I realized that actually you can be alive and you can do great things, and your work can be recognized and your creativity can be recognized. Well, in the Chinese sense, we have been educated as you can't make any money, you will be broke being an artist, and you won't be, your work can only be recognized when after you died. And so I told my parents, I was studying in Macquarie University. Doing finance and accounting, double degree, and I told my parents, as soon as I know that you can be alive and doing great things, I told my parents, no, I'm gonna just study design, just anything that can get me into the design industry later.
Excellent.
And that's
well, Hugh, talk to us about what's happening here with the changing values and the way millennials are looking at the world differently to the values of baby boomers and Gen X.
Yeah, I have enormous faith in the future for various reasons, and one of them is the millennials. It seems to me that this much maligned generation is actually better equipped than any of us for what the future is going to be like. And I don't say that just because that might be true of every rising generation of young people, but the particular formation of this generation coming through a very turbulent period, as children coming through a very turbulent period in Australia's history, learning to live with uncertainty, unpredictability. Absolutely, the air they breathe is keep your options open. You never know what's around the corner. As soon as you get a piece of technology, you know it must be already outmoded. That's why it's on the market. The next one is already on the way. I don't know if you remember when the global financial crisis hit, there were a lot of parents and employers saying of millennials, this will sort them out, a bit of a tough period, not realising that this is the very generation best equipped to deal with turbulence, uncertainty, unpredictability. So as the millennials move into, as they are about to do, into positions of major power, influence, control in Australian society and in our institutions, I think we're going to see a fascinating and wonderful cultural revolution.
I think
actually,
that's so important.
sorry to
Go,
interrupt,
Danling,
but I actually lost my first job in the GFC.
Yeah.
And that was that to my mind was, oh my God, what am I gonna do? But within 2 or 3 months, I found another job. But actually, it was through some miracle that Robin Wakefield, she's here today.
As well.
And
Go see her later.
yeah, so that was, I think that was completely to me a miracle, because I already took the risk to not studying accounting to be here, and that's impossible that I will be able to get my permanent residency here. And my parents was already worried, because it's like, oh, what are you gonna do? You need to find a job here.
Yeah.
And I think it just it's belief. A lot of things to do with how you see where you want to be.
And it was interesting that you mentioned about the loneliness, and Hugh and I have spoken a lot about that the UK appointed a loneliness minister. It's the first one, and I believe we have a candidate for Australia's first loneliness minister here. I think it'd be amazing. But talk to us about loneliness. It's a big theme that comes up in your research.
Yeah. I mean, if to compare the 90s, compare when I was writing Reinventing Australia with now, when I was writing Australia Reimagined, the biggest single change, I mean, that's a big call, because I suppose the information technology revolution may be the biggest. But I think in terms of our culture, in terms of the sort of society we are, the biggest change is that we have an epidemic of mental illness. We have, last year, 2 million Australians, this is beyond Blues figures, 2 million Australians suffering from anxiety, another 2 million suffering from depression, and another million roughly with assorted related mental illnesses, and a prediction that 40% of us will experience actual diagnosable mental illness in our lifetime. This is a huge change. And you can say, well, there are lots of reasons why people get anxious: job insecurity, the state of the planet, relationship breakdown, all sorts of things. But when you're talking about an epidemic, you've got to look at the society. And I think there's never just one explanation for anything, but the biggest single factor driving our mental illness crisis at the moment is social fragmentation, an increase in the reality and the risk of social isolation and loneliness. And that's happening because our households are shrinking. Every fourth household now in Australia contains just one person. They're not all lonely, but the risk of loneliness is greatly increased. It's going to be one household in 3 within the next 10 or 12 years. That's a totally different from society from the one we grew up in. Every third household with just one person. Continuing high rate of divorce, very fragmenting. More mobile than ever. We're moving house on average once every 6 years, and we're more mobile in the car sense as well. We live in Dido suburbs, drive in, drive out, wave at your neighbour's car, assume your neighbour is driving, but it's very different from stopping and saying good day. And of course, we're so busy. This is a socially fragmented. We don't, I think, fully grasp that our busyness often acts like a barrier between us and especially the neighbours. I think the neighbourhood is in for a huge revival. I mean, one symbolic difference between the 90s and now, in the 90s we were saying good day. In 2018 we're saying, how are you going? Well, busy? As though, what, are you dead or are you busy? There's only an off-on switch, as though busyness is now a social virtue. And of course the IT revolution is this huge paradox. We're all in the grip of this paradox. It's promising that we'll be more connected than ever, and we are. And it's also making it easier than ever for us to stay apart from each other. And so we now have the latest research on young, heavy users of social media showing that they report high levels of social isolation and loneliness and anxiety because there's not enough face-to-face, there's not enough person-to-person, not enough friendly arm on the shoulder and eye contact and all those things that reassure us that we belong here and we're part of, we're tribal creatures. We're social animals. We absolutely need communities to belong to. and the online community won't do it.
Yeah, and Hugh talks a lot about finding the tribe and also the herd. We're herd animals. So Will, I want to throw to you and find out what has been your tribe, because you mentioned that you'd gone through really hard times. And if you want to share, like, I think you are a busy person, and
Sure.
like you've got agencies in LA and moving around. How have you kind of come to this place where you're
sort of had to shift tribes a bit. So I've sort of got my family as my real core tribe, Holly and Henry and Rose, my wife and kids. And, I've really, in the last, 18 months, really made that the priority to be, very present for them and prioritise them sort of over everything. In our industry, there's a huge amount of kind of excuse to kind of just work late or do whatever. And there's always an event in our industry, in the media and the arts. And also the drugs and alcohol just prevalent in the industry. So I got clean and sober 18 months ago and decided to make a real life change to be present for my kids. My son was growing up, he was about to go to high school. It was really affecting my relationship with my wife and my children. So I had a huge life change moment where I had to completely redefine everything and give up that kind of last man standing guy at the pub tribe or the life of the party tribe, which I held on to since I was a teenager, really. So that was my kind of go-to mode where I'd feel, I'd just race there if I was ever feeling insecure or whatever. It was always there. There was always that crew that I could go to. Yeah. And that stemmed out of all this kind of hip-hop culture and bravado and being kind of confident guys, but really we were shit scared, I think. So it kind of, it was a really funny time. And so, I just made a concerted effort to get down to 2 tribes. So my family life at home and my wonderful Heckler tribe here, which I'm very fortunate to have a really healthy company.
Yeah, I think it's incredible. And Danling, for you, you've talked about not quite having a tribe. You've sort of got a lot of different groups. Tell us about that.
I think the word tribe has become just a boring marketing term that, you create your tribe and you get people in and you sell them something in exchange of something else. And then if you don't do business with me, you're out of my tribe. I think that's really dividing, and I really agree with what Hugh says, that it's about the connection of with people. But I think for my definition of tribe, I think my tribe is the universe. Is the trees, the flowers, and people who we meet or who we haven't met. Or I usually, when I dream, I meet a lot of people in my dreams as well, and I really believe that it's like some kind of astral travel to somewhere else, that I get to meet other people.
I'm going to bring Hugh in on that, because one of your solutions for this epidemic of depression and anxiety, that you've got 4 things that will get you to go through, but one, if you can share about nature, the connection with nature.
Yeah, again, very interesting research on nature deprivation syndrome. What happens to kids, especially when they don't climb a tree and get dirty and roll on the grass and all that sort of stuff. Their anxiety level goes up. It's extraordinary how I don't know if anyone watched Don't Stop the Music on ABC television. Extraordinary how many young kids in that program were talking about stress and anxiety. These 8 and 9-year-old kids. Now that's often to do with a lack of time out with nature, and I think that's we ignore that, all of us, at our peril, but especially with our kids. It's important to make sure that they
I take my daughter down to Bondi every morning. That's our sort of routine. She's 8 years old, and we go down, we grab a coffee and we go to Flat Rock, and she likes to do this thing, Jam Up the Car, which she'll play me her latest kind of playlist, which does include some 90s gangster rap, which I'm thrilled about. But also she's very into the piano now. But it's a time where we can really connect, and she'll tell me how much of a complex character she is and all her sort of woes, and she does have anxiety at school. And so that's the sort of forum for that, when we're sitting down watching the surfers every morning, and that's our little, that's our time in nature, and she'll really communicate like beautifully with me, and that's our little ritual routine every day.
I love the idea of nostalgia. We're seeing scrunchies come back. I'm wearing flares tonight. And maybe we can think, like for you, Danling, what are the things that you're nostalgic about in your childhood? What do you remember that you think, in the good old days?
We don't really get really close to the nature, actually, because we grew up in the city, and and in China we have this sort of like caged, like how do you call it? Like we have window, but then we also have like a cage, sort of like wrapped around the window, so no one can jump out of the building. That's one of the things that
What are some fond memories for you from childhood?
I say maybe like going to the park with my grandparents when they do Tai Chi, and we were just like sort of hanging out with them. But we also play a lot of mahjong. So that's like one of our favorite activities with our grandparents, because that's like a must in our family. So if you are not playing mahjong, you're out.
That's your tribe there. So for real,
it's really amazing because it's all mathematics. And it's all like, you have groups, and you sort of like, you really train your mind how to learn. And at that young age, I think it's really helpful. Yeah. But my parents still play mahjong, and they play with money.
Like, who wins, your father?
No, he always loses.
Oh, very good. So for Will, what do you...
By the way, I should say that
Please.
the urbanisation of particularly Western societies led to a very smart Californian marketing executive launching the pet rock movement. I don't know if anyone is old enough to remember pet rocks, but that was a way of getting nature into a high rise. And they were pretty low maintenance pets.
Yeah, very. Did you have a pet rock, or what's your nostalgia about growing up and things that you think were better back in the day?
I think we had a pretty idyllic growing up. Our families lived, there was 3 families all in the one big house together in Hunters Hill, so they all sort of pulled in, and there was that whole wonderful kind of just kids and freedom, and all of those years were amazing. I think the primary school years were all a real dream, really, and then high school hit, and it changed pretty drastically, but I think we had a very privileged and very peaceful upbringing filled with family and joy, and there was that community there. We were all there. There was always someone to look after the kids, even if it wasn't your parent, and we just kind of roamed free. So I think that was a pretty special time.
And now for your kids, we mentioned with Rose and Henry, what are you concerned about for them?
Certainly bullying's a big deal at school for Rose. Henry not so much. He's a little bit older, he's about to go into year 7, and he's just sort of in his mode, he's cruising, he surfs every day, he's got his mates, and he's really focused on his stuff, and he's a good bloke. But she really has struggled this year in year 3, going, I don't know, last year they were little angels, and this year it's
Girls are mean.
Wow. So she was coming home crying of an afternoon, and that was really sad for us. And she's dealing with it, but we've banned the phones during the week completely. Newington's banned the phones at school starting this next semester, so Henry will be the first kid to go through that new policy. You can take it to school, but it's in your locker throughout the day. So I think we're probably a bit more controlling than our baby boomer parents, and we're a lot more strict with certain things, particularly social media is the big one. And we let them roam free. Like Henry can go down, he can grab his surfboard.
Because you know where he is with his iPhone to track him.
Well, no, we'll let him go surfing on his own at 11 down at Bondi anymore. Like he can do that, that's fine. We're happy for him to do that. And Rose can walk around the block with her dog, a real dog, not a pet rock. So that's been a lovely new addition, Bob the dog, to our family. So yeah, just trying to get them off the screens a lot, and particularly Rose, who's a very kind of different kid. She's quite quirky and creative, and I think that's she does not fit the mould of this little kind of girly girl at all. She grew up with skateboarders and surfers, and she's a bit more kind of she's just got her own style. So I think that's tough in primary school to be different.
I want to come back to identity. I think that's a big one. But Hugh, let's ask you, what's your nostalgia? I know you caution us about looking back and thinking things were great, so you can answer with that in mind. But what are you nostalgic for in your childhood?
Yes, I mean, my childhood sounded remarkably like Will's, even though it was about 100 years earlier. But I grew up in a beautiful little middle-class suburb where all the neighbours knew each other, and exactly as Will said, I mean, if your parents weren't there, someone's parents were. There was this idea of it takes a village to raise a child. So I wouldn't say I'm nostalgic for it in the sense that I wish that I could go back there, but I hear endless stories from people who do wish that the contemporary neighbourhood had some more of that village quality. I mean, when you hear people in cities like Sydney and Melbourne saying we don't know our neighbours, that's very sad, but it's also a very serious reflection on the breakdown of the neighbourhood as the social unit.
Yeah.
So we're very much concerned now about just the family and then friendship groups and work colleagues and so on. I think we've forgotten that the health of a society really can be measured by the health of its neighbourhoods, because this is the test of whether we're civilised humans, whether we can get along with these strange people who happen to be in our street. We don't choose our neighbours, they're not like friends. But the loss of the status neighbour or our consciousness of that role that we have, I think is a very disturbing trend over the last 25 years. However, I do see and hear from all over Australia wonderful stories of how people have seen what's happening, have understood that social isolation is a precursor to disease, and not just mental health. I mean, there's some interesting research just out this week, the American Journal of Epidemiology, showing all the physical ailments that go along with social isolation. So we're starting to get that. And I hear these wonderful stories about people who are taking initiatives in their own street. You know, we'll have a drink on Friday night, or come to the park once a month on Sunday, bring some food and drink, and we'll all get to know each other. All these things are starting to happen, I think, as a really healthy reaction to the way we've been degenerating and becoming more socially fragmented. Our basic humanity always prevails, and I think it's about to prevail again.
And you've got some great stories about, I think, you know, if you love thy neighbour, and it's about culturally diverse neighbourhoods as well, and making sure that, like you said, we're not in the little echo chamber of just the people that we like. But
Yes.
so there's two things that you've gone through: the being in touch with nature, and also then loving thy neighbour. What are the other two things that really help us with this anxiety epidemic?
I think the biggest challenge all of us face is the challenge of taking each other seriously, having time to give to people who we meet at the bus stop, or certainly people who are our neighbours, but even colleagues. The deepest, I think the deepest of all human desires is the desire to be taken seriously. And when we become more socially fragmented, busier, more anxious, we lose sight of the fact that that's what everybody needs, but it requires time. It means we do have to rethink the way we live, to say, well, there are people here who need me to listen to them. There's a frail elderly woman at the end of the street who's getting on okay, but she'd like someone to talk to her.
Yeah.
And I'd better make the time to do that.
And yet, how do we do that with rampant individualism? And like, for us, it's all become about our own needs rather than connecting outside. And yet, with that increasing anxiety, how do we move beyond ourselves?
Well, I mean, the so-called European Enlightenment has a lot to answer for, the 18th century phenomenon, because it really, I mean, its long-term effect has been to promote individualism and materialism at the expense of our sense of ourselves as members of a community, a family, a society. I think neuroscientists who are now putting psychologists out of work because they can actually look at the brain and see what's happening, they say you can find in the human brain the cooperative centre. So that's in our DNA. That's natural for us to behave like social beings. You can't find the competitive centre. That's something we learn. That's part of the rise of rampant individualism. And I think we've got to relax a bit into a fresh realisation of what it means to be a human being. And what it means to be a human being is we are part of a species that is social, that does require healthy, functioning communities, and unless we engage with them, they'll wither and we'll become more individualistic and therefore more anxious, all those things that follow. So I think it's really a matter of us looking in the mirror and saying, I see what's in the mirror, a human. Yeah. One of the things I know about humans is they need each other. And that doesn't just mean they need each other commercially or familially. we need each other more broadly than that.
And we'll come back to your fourth one. I keep interrupting now, but I'd like to ask Danling, how do you feel about that as far as your identity? And you've obviously spent a lot of time when you've come out to Australia feeling isolated. How have you crafted your identity through your work and through your connections and inner life?
I think it's just being myself, rather than, being fearful to be judged or, to fear about the future. I think it's more kind of being in the now and just being myself.
Do you feel there's more permission for millennials to do that? We see there's not one set fashion style, or like it's almost promoting a culture of individuality. Do you think that helps this time in history?
I think in my circle of millennials, I haven't seen anyone who really actually have this kind of like strong individuality in them that it's all about themselves. But I do also believe that like attract likes. So in a way that because I practice mindfulness and also compassion, and I think that way I attract people who are similar to me.
You're going to love Hugh's book then.
By the way, just another lovely thing to be said about millennials. They are, I think, a far more cooperative generation, a far more herd-based generation than X or boomers. I mean, boomers really led the charge towards individualism, but Danling has just used the word compassion, which is the other thing on my list. It's an old-fashioned sort of word, isn't it? But I don't think of compassion as some sort of bleeding heart thing. I think of compassion as the only rational response we can make to a full understanding of what it means to be human. Once you realise that we're all in this thing together, that we actually do need each other, how else should we respond to each other except kindly and with respect, especially in the case of people we don't like much, and most especially in the case of people we disagree with. Imagine how our parliament could be transformed.
Yes, exactly.
If the full human understanding of the need for compassion animated that whole institution.
And for you, Will, as far as constructing your identity, I guess it's kindness to yourself in a way that has made this transition.
Yeah, look, a lot of it. It's like that's constant search for me. But yeah, definitely, there was a lot of pain and guilt there in my in sort of my identity there that I had to shift out of. So I really had to shift gears, because I was stuck in a real, I suffered depression for a long time and used substances to sort of medicate with that and deal with the crazy industry and stress. So that was a huge awakening for me and a real, I had to find myself again. I was very emotionally not intelligent, unintelligent. So really going back to the basics and fundamentals for me has been, it was like hitting a reset button, 18 months ago for me and realising, wow, how much I had to actually learn. So I'm just back on a whole new path, which for me has been, it's exciting, but it was terrifying to begin with. Like shifting at 40 is not an easy thing to, duck and weave, you duck and weave. There's boxing gloves down there. I still don't know what they're for. I'm just slightly terrified if I say the wrong thing, I could be in trouble. But yeah, it was a real, shift, and I had to change lanes completely.
And what were your peers doing at that time? Was this sort of this change in a lot lot of people, or you really
Not
broke
really.
away?
There's a little bit of a movement. In our industry, it's tough. You're surrounded by it and you're expected to do it. And it's a very, male-driven kind of a thing. Come on, mate, be the last man standing. Everyone eggs each other on. And it's rampant in our entertainment industry. It's a problem. And male depression is, I'm most likely to harm myself at 40 than anything else. So I'm my own worst, my own biggest threat. That's a statistic, I'm sure, that we're most likely to commit suicide. That's the highest cause of male death in my brackets. There's some pretty bad stats, and I think a lot of that's fueled by mental health issues, but then really punctuated and accentuated heavily by our drinking culture. Yeah, for sure. And
I think what's interesting with this book, and I definitely encourage you all to grab a copy, it's about changing society starts with us, and I think you often hear these stories, but I think that there can be an incredible society shift if we actually have some kindness. Let's talk about the last solution, if I can use that word. So it's about being part of something greater, Hugh. So can you talk about that?
Yeah. There's now very compelling research suggesting that the fulfilling life depends on all the things we've been talking about, but also putting your faith in something larger, something greater than yourself. Now, throughout history, for most people, that's been religion. In contemporary Western societies like Australia, it's certainly not. In the last census, 52% of Australians did identify as Christian and another 10% identified with other religions. So there's still a lot of people who want to wear a vaguely religious label, and many more want to send their kids to church schools than want to go to church. Only about 8% of Australians are weekly church attenders. So it's not necessarily religion. And in fact, the research on this subject doesn't say, well, it has to be religion, but it has to be something. We have to place our faith in something greater than ourselves if we are to lead a fulfilling life, because a fulfilling life depends on having some sense of meaning and purpose, and that usually involves this big thing. Now, for some people, it's the country, the society. For some people, it's the family. For some people, it's the organisation. For some people, it's the Prime Minister, although that would be a misleading. I heard recently that paramedics can no longer use the question, who is the Prime Minister? If they're trying to test cognitive function. But so I think that's, I wrote a book, the book before this one called Beyond Belief, which was how people do find meaning in their lives. And by the time I'd finished writing that book, one of the things that occurred to me is that I was no longer remotely interested in what people believe, because everyone has their own beliefs and they all think they're right and they think everyone else is wrong. That's a fruitless exercise. But the really interesting thing is, what do you put your faith in? And until we've figured out what we're going to put our faith in, then we diminish ourselves.
And as examples, we've had mindfulness is an example of having faith in something else. For you, Will, what would be an idea of something that you put your faith in?
Oh, look, back to the mindfulness thing, just walking in, it's a little bit not for me, but I walked into Henry's year 7 Meet the Teacher Day, whatever it was, and mindfulness was one of the things on the boards. And so they, I think, teaching kids and giving them the tools and preparing them, particularly young men, about compassion, about being present, about mindfulness. I was so impressed that they were teaching that as part of the curriculum right next to chemistry and English. I think that's the real shift in education. And he's got a much better shot at being able to deal with whatever life throws at him, because they're addressing that and they've identified that as a huge problem in men in our society. And I think, hopefully the system helps them out a bit, and certainly that's one school that's doing a great job. So that gave me a lot of hope for his generation.
And for you, Danling, so is mindfulness, or is it more about creativity?
Definitely creativity, because I believe that's in my blood. Without creativity, I wouldn't be here today. I mean being alive. And I really agree with Hugh about having the purpose in life, in the work we do, or in all sorts of aspects. And for me, it was till a few years ago when I find a purpose in the work I do. Advocate for sustainable living, for the environment. That's when I find that I can keep on working on whatever I do, even with clients' projects or with my own projects. I have a purpose to work for, and that's what keeps me going. And I think that's something that I'm gonna keep going.
And I haven't had time to talk about all the things that Danling has done, but it's definitely worth jumping on Mundane Matters. It's incredible. She's gone around the world speaking, done Apple Talks, and 40,000 followers on her Instagram. It's just really incredible, and just recently completed an installation for City of Sydney at Customs House, which is about sustainability and
we collect 120 kilograms of marine debris from the Great Barrier Reef and recycle them into objects, and hang them up 24 meters high from the ceiling down to the ground. Yes, wonderful project.
So I'm going to throw open to the floor because we're almost at the end, and I know Jane needs to run off. But who's got some questions for our panel? I'll take 2 questions. Loredana.
Straight away. I've been thinking a lot about other cultures like the Chinese culture, and Danling talked about how grandparents were a big part of her life and raising them. I feel, you didn't comment about it, but I feel I came here as my parents came here and I was born and I don't have contact with my grandparents. But I felt like Australian friends of mine were embarrassed of their grandparents. That Australians have really poor connection to their elders. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it is about to change because the boomers won't put up with it. From the time they were adolescents and realised what spending power and just sheer numbers they had, they've been a loud voice and they've transformed our society as this huge cohort has moved through. And now they're becoming grandparents. The oldest of them has just turned 70.
They were our babysitters.
Yeah. Well, there you are. It's a very interesting thing that for the first time, really, in Australian culture, there's a very common phenomenon now of grandparents moving in and sharing the childcare responsibility. The bond between the current crop of young children in Australia and their grandparents is going to be probably the strongest grandparent-grandchild bond that we've had in our history. Well, in the last 100 years. I mean, if you go back about 100 years, it was very typical to have 3 generations living in one household. Our typical household sizes were much bigger than they are now, and very typically 3 generations under one roof. But around about the 1920s, 1930s, the nuclear family became the household, the fashionable household, and that was the beginning of grandparents being kind of sidelined. We made the nuclear family the social unit rather than the extended family. But that's all changing under economic pressure, apart from any other factors. So I think your observation is completely accurate, and it's about to change.
My biggest question is I still feel like we don't have that respect and care for.
But that's cultural, you're asking. Let me grab another question. Last one, there's a few minutes left.
I've got like 700 questions. But I think the key thing is specifically about loneliness. Have we lost the art of conversation and storytelling to each other? Because we are energetic beings. So when we sit and have a conversation, something happens to us. Have we lost that because of the onslaught, for lack of a better word, of social media? So everything's very short and sharp and very picture orientated, and we're not actually engaging with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a major social issue in all Western societies. I can't speak confidently about other societies, but certainly in the countries we would compare ourselves with, this is now regarded as a huge problem. Raising a generation of kids who are extremely adept with information technology, but not so adept at just hanging out and having a conversation, hence the loneliness epidemic of the heavy social media users. If you can't tell the difference between what happens when we talk face-to-face to each other and we exchange a text or Instagram post or whatever it is, there's something wrong. And we're in danger of blurring that distinction, of people thinking, well, we're in constant touch, this is communication. It's not, it's data transfer. Communication for humans involves eye contact, sometimes touch, facial expression, posture, gestures, rate of speech, tone of voice, and constant feeding back, people grunting and frowning, and so you're getting constant responses to what you're saying. A conversation is a rich, nuanced, complex, wonderful conduit for human contact, and we haven't reproduced it in this. I'm not against social media, I'm not against the IT revolution, who could be? It's changed the way we live in many wonderful ways, but in this way, it is a huge worry that, I mean, it was a joy to hear Will describing what happens, the conversation in the car and down at the beach as a daily thing. So many kids are not getting that. Parents saying, oh, well, my kids send each other texts from bedroom to bedroom. I mean, they're not even having a conversation with each other at home. So the loss of social skills and verbal skills is a huge potential worry.
Well, I might wrap it there. We're gonna, Ali's gonna jump up to be able to purchase some of Hugh's books, and he's trapped here until they're all signed. So, but please thank our incredible panel. Normally we give the girls flowers, but Danling messaged me and said, "Don't give me flowers, my cat will eat them and vomit." So we haven't done that. But thank you so much for being part of the program this year, and you'll be able to find a recap of the past few months on our blog, and then stay tuned, we're going to start off again our 5th year of Insight in February next year. So thank you, everyone.